So I'm sure you've had this thought in the past, whether you were at school or at your job and said, you know what, I've been working on this long enough, good enough, let's move along. Well, watch brands sometimes do this too, and today we're going to be looking at 10 things watch brands do to cut corners, or ultimately maybe just don't keep in mind what the consumer wants and are trying to cater to that to the fullest extent. So these are going to be sometimes things where they're just straight up cutting costs. Other times, maybe it's just an oversight and not understanding what a consumer wants, but really just things that I hope that you'll maybe be able to identify and be more aware of. All of this is kind of a little bit more subjective though as well at times, depending on the cost, its positioning, and the brand itself. But I do think these are just helpful indicators to look for across the industry when you're looking to buy your next watch. Now, before we jump into this idea, I do want to mention if you're in the market for looking for good value at an attainable price, we do have a new article, updated article looking at 50 of the best automatic watches under $500 for 2022. This was a very comprehensive list we put together looking at a variety of different styles, brands. I definitely recommend checking that out. We'll have a link in the description down below. And while you're over there, definitely check out the new collection of watches that we have available on teddybaldassarre.com. You're able to shop all new releases, some new cool stuff that we've just gotten in. There's a wide variety of G-Shocks. So when you're talking about a brand that doesn't cut corners and watches that typically don't cut corners, I think the G-Shock is a perfect embodiment of that idea. So definitely check those out. Brand new Casiokes, new generations, also looking at some new different case styles and options. Plenty to get lost in. That will also be in the description down below. And now for our first point here, we have a good one, and that is using pins and collars or shifting away from screwed in links and moving into more of a pin and collar system or just pin adjusted links. Now, this is not as much of a big deal when you're talking about more attainable watches. I honestly think it's okay for anything under $3,000. Anything that's in that range, if you can get screwed in links, I think that's a bonus, as long as it's not a really tedious process for changing the links. I don't mind it as much in that price range. Where this starts to get really ugly is when we're talking about watches that are going for thousands and thousands of dollars. I think one that comes to mind is Patek Philippe with their bracelets on something like the Nautilus or Aquanaut that use pin system instead of screwed in links. Now, this is not crazy amount of cost saving, but it is going to be easier to create a specific pin system rather than having to worry about threading on these links and then also finding a screw that will accompany that. So it's not necessarily saving much, but it is something to look out for. I think generally speaking, if it's easy to fix or switch out or size your bracelet, I think that's what's most important, as long as it feels good and doesn't feel that it's really off base. But I do believe that most would agree that they prefer screwed links compared to a pin system. So for point number 2 here, things to look out for, we have date wheels. And there are many things that will fall underneath this category. I think the first one that comes to mind is that ghost position for a watch that doesn't have a date. And basically what this means is a watch will have typically, when it's a no date, 2 positions, but instead, some brands will just put a movement in there that will have a date function, despite there not being an open aperture for the date to actually be seen. So when you actually pull the crown to the second position, you can adjust the date that's not there. Typically what happens here is a brand is either not wanting to remove the date, or they're buying some Bosch movements off the shelf and they want to buy as much supply as possible. Many of these different movement manufacturers are going to have minimum orders. So instead of trying to just buy what they need, what they'll do is they'll buy more of a specific movement, like an ETA 2824, and then utilize that movement in watches that don't have a date. And it's a nice way to maximize their buy and get more at that minimum order requirement and hit that. And then also will allow them not have to worry about buying a total different set of movements for that case. Now, is this the worst thing in the world? No. Does it bother me as much? Not really, but I think this is definitely a cost-cutting measure that some brands do. Also, other things, color match date wheels, maybe just finding something that's just really run-of-the-mill, not going the extra mile there. I don't think this is as big of a deal, but for some people, this really bothers them, having a date that clashes with the dial. I find it more with the position of the date that bothers me more. And I think a good example of this is when you're using a movement that is going to have a date that is too far inward, it doesn't actually fit all the way to the outskirts of the dial, or at least closer to the outskirts, and just looks off. Have you ever just seen a watch that like the date window is like tucked really close to the center dial and it just looks off? It doesn't look like it belongs in that. And instead of maybe just opting for going for a no date option, they just said, good enough, let's throw it out, we're ready to go, sell as many as you can. For point number 3, we have stamp clasps. Now, I have mixed feelings about this one because I do think people overblow the idea of a stamp clasp. If it's in anything over $1,000, people start freaking out. I think there are good stamp clasps out there, But there's no question finding something that is milled and is going to be built from a solid chunk of steel is always going to feel more premium in comparison. So Zinn, of course, with their over manufacturing, I think have amazing bracelets. They're H-link bracelets, but many people are going to talk about the Clasp not maybe being in the same level as some of the other things that they do from a manufacturing perspective. Marathon, love the brand. Their bracelets, I think, very good. The Clasp is a little bit behind. So this is where I see it actually happening, is they do all the work and then there's just this one little point that is maybe not going the extra mile. I think many stamp clasps, like Marathon, is perfectly fine clasp. It's just, it does feel a little bit disconnected from some of the other efforts that they're putting forth with their watches. One other point I'll mention though, you have to have, I think, a understanding of where the watch is positioned. If you're yelling at Seiko 5 sports watches for having a stamped clasp, I think that's a little bit off base in my opinion, because you're talking about a watch that's under $500 across the board, so I don't think you can get mad about that. I think anything under $1,000 for the most part, I wouldn't get mad at a stamp clasp. It's just starting to get into that 4-figure range where I think people like to see more milled components and going the extra mile when you're starting to really throw down a good chunk of money for a watch. So now for our next point here, we have superficial architecture to make the watch look higher end or kind of to confuse the consumer. This could be with bridges or just artificial bridges or looking at just the case itself. But where I think this is the most probably misleading and I just think is kind of gross is when brands, and mostly they're not brands that I will cover on this channel, but say you have like a skeleton oriented watch, they're using a basic Miyota caliber on the inside, and then they'll stack like some just random like plastic parts over the top of it to make it seem like this high-end skeleton watch with these hollowed out skeletonized bridges that you'll see in something like a Richard Mille or anything of that sort. But they're still using just a basic Miyota 3-handed movement. I just think this is kind of silly once you know what's actually going on. It always looks way better in the renders, but then when you get something in person, you're like, what is this? What is going on here? Again, this typically doesn't happen with brands that I talk about on this channel, but you see it quite a bit with different fashion-oriented watches, maybe homage watches to kind of higher-end brands, and I just always think this is kind of nasty and just a very obvious way of making the watch appear like something that is clearly not. Next up, we have the technique of guilloché, and it comes with a stamping process rather than using a true rose engine to develop that guilloché pattern. Now, if you're not familiar with guilloché, this is when a trained technician can get on a lathe and will be able to make small micro cuts into a material in order to create this really cool weave pattern that basically creates endless possibilities. Typically, this is a very time-intensive, focused process. If you've ever seen somebody on a rose engine machine, you'll understand how this is a true art form. And there are many brands that what they'll do is they'll just have a stamping process. They'll have something that's just very textured to really emulate that look. If you're talking about watches under $5,000 and honestly even almost $10,000, I think it's okay to have this at times with some restraint, as long as they're not marketing it out aggressively as like this hand craftsmanship. But I do believe that there are brands out there that market this guilloché as you start to get to the higher end where there might actually not be some rose engine happening. Again, if you're talking about more attainable watches, not a big deal, but as you start to get higher end, I think the requirements of going the extra mile start to become more of an obvious need. And this is one area where I think brands could cut the corners if they wanted to. So the ones that don't, I think you have to applaud them, but just something to look out for. For our next point here, we have micro adjustment. And I think this is more of an oversight than it is just a cost-cutting measure in most instances. I think this is 2 points. One is, ideally, you'd love to have some on-the-fly adjustment, but this is going to be limiting depending on the type of clasp that you have. If you have a butterfly clasp, it's gonna be really hard to pull this off. If you had a fold-over clasp, much easier, but even with a stamp clasp, this does require a lot more effort and thought process. But where I'm kind of more talking about is when it's completely just overlooked by a brand. Maybe not including half links in the watch bracelet where you can't size it up accordingly. If you don't have that fold over clasp, you have like more of a butterfly style clasp, I think having a half link in there is great. Another thing that really bugs me is when you have this nice clasp, clearly nice and has room for micro adjustment, and they don't even punch holes in it to allow you to have some on the fly adjustment. This is simply just punching holes in steel and should be very simple from a manufacturing process. So it doesn't even cost that much more money to do it. But I think from an enthusiast standpoint and a sizing standpoint, it will allow utmost flexibility to be able to pull a watch off. An example of this is the Rado Captain Cook clasp, their Beads of Rice bracelet, where they have this nice clasp. It's a very nice bracelet, but it always bugs me that there's not holes in that clasp to allow just some simple micro adjustment, even if I have to use a spring bar tool. I think at the bare minimum, if you have this style of clasp, just punch some holes in it. It's not gonna cost you a ton of money. So this isn't much a cost-cutting measure as it is really just an oversight by some of these brands. But I do think that when you do see brands going the extra mile for micro adjustment, it's always great to see, and I think you have to applaud them. Now, I don't want to get into the idea of quality control in this video because I think that's a whole different idea and it could just be pretty much pertaining to anything in the world of watchmaking. But there's one that I do want to mention, and that is with bezel / chapter ring alignment, or misalignment, I should say. And this is really just, I think, bugs a lot of consumers out there. There's one brand that I think is very famous for this, and I think some people give them a pass, some others don't, and that is Seiko. Seiko is pretty notorious for this in not having their chapter rings and their bezel line up. This sometimes is seen as a little bit of a funny joke within like the enthusiast community, but I think it is a big issue. And also, as Seiko has continued to offer up more models within their Luxe collection of over $1,000, I think this becomes a more concerning theme that the brand has been known for. So this is an obvious one, not going the extra mile from a QC standpoint. This is, I think, the first one that comes to mind for me that is so avoidable. Things that you can see with the naked eye and still go ahead and push forward with. That's where things start to get unacceptable. When you're talking about small blemishes on a dial, when you get really tight with macro at a more attainable perspective, there's times where I've noticed smaller things on dials that could never see with the naked eye. And a lot of our macro photography, that sometimes happens where you just get to see these small little blemishes where things aren't perfect, but this is on a microscopic level. When it comes to these bezels, this is not the case. I can look at it right on a wrist across the room sometimes and be like, oh boy, somebody didn't do their job there. So this one might not be as much of a cost-cutting measure as it is just straight up misleading. And that is having these movement naming conventions for basic Bosch or third-party movements. Many brands are guilty for this. I think the whole industry could do a better job with transparency when it comes to the idea of movements. And I don't think it's a bad thing to have a third-party movement. I don't know why, as enthusiasts, I'd really like to just almost eliminate the idea of like in-house manufacturing, because the truth is, pretty much every brand doesn't do this. It's all borrowing from somewhere when it comes to some part or component, or just having some ownership structure. There's all this complexity to it that I think this whole in-house thing is so silly that I kind of like to avoid it whenever possible. But where I do have a problem with this is when brands will take this desire for enthusiasts to have an in-house movement and then just come up with this random naming convention for a Sleater at a movement like the SR7527 whatever. And it's just a basic off-the-shelf movement, or just has a modified rotor. I shouldn't even say modified. It's not modified. It's just a rotor on a basic movement. And that, to me, doesn't count. I really respect when brands are just able to say, hey, this is an ETA movement, ETA 2892 inside of our watches. That, to me, I think big respect. And I think people value transparency. When a brand does do that, I'm like, all right, I respect that. They're not hiding anything. It's where brands start to get a little bit sneaky with things that I don't really like. I think that's a little scummy. I don't think that's the best idea. I think the whole industry could be a little bit more transparent about this type of idea. So this is more of just a general misleading characteristic that some brands have rather than just an oversight. But it is a way for brands to maybe bolster up their image to make them seem more like as a true in-house vertically integrated manufacturer when maybe they're not as much, but that's not a big deal. I think the act of doing this is the big deal. To follow here, I'm just going to make the point: Lume, Superluminova, Luminova, any form of ability to see the watch better in lower lit conditions. The really point here is when brands just kind of, okay, it's got Lume, Superluminova, just put it on there and don't really test it out to see how it performs. How much of the material should we add to the dial? How should we apply it? Or just point blank, just not really testing it out whatsoever. I've handled watches in the past where I've been like, wow, is this even lumed? What's going on? But I remember the Doxa Sub 200. I was really underwhelmed by the lume on that watch, and for a brand with all this dive watch pedigree, you'd love to see better lume on a watch like that. So I just think this is something where brands could, if they're gonna go with the lume route and you're trying to really lean into that tool watch format, I think the least you could do is try to make sure it's at least adequate and will do the job and will not just go away immediately. I'd like to be able to, when it does, just even if it doesn't last for hours, at least give me like 5 minutes, or I could see it a little bit and when it's dark in the room or wherever environment I'm in. I think that's just the one point I'll mention here. Just really poorly applied lume to a dial surface or hands or wherever. So for this next one here, this is a point that I think enthusiasts have increasingly become more just adamant about seeing in their watches, and that is having a hacking movement. Hacking movement basically referring to the stopping of the second hand when you pull the crown out to the farthest position to set the time. So this is something that was avoided in the past because of the potential damage it could cause the movement. Now with newer movement technology, this is not much of an issue, but still there are many brands that do not have this hacking function. I don't think if you have this crazy high complicated minute repeater that this is going to be a requirement, but I would say for most brands out there, enthusiasts are going to prefer to have a hacking movement versus a non-hacking movement. If you can have the feature, it's always better. It helps with setting precise time more effectively, and it's just a useful feature. I think it's nice to have. And if a manufacturer can do it effectively, I think it's an absolute no-brainer to do so. I don't think it's a deal breaker for watches that are, say, under $500, but it's always nice to see it. And the truth is, there are a lot of high horology brands that still will have non-hacking movements. And when you're spending $20,000 plus and then you can't even set precise time to like an atomic clock or anything like that, or your phone, I mean, yeah, I can see why people would be a little upset. I think once you get to that point, it's not really about telling the time anymore. And really, I think this whole category of watch making is not about telling the time when you talk about the mechanical watchmaking perspective, but still it is a very useful feature to have. So to have it versus not have it, I think everybody would say it's better to have it than not. Next, we have movements that don't fit the case. This is not as big of a deal for me. This is more getting back into that idea where you can just tell whether you flip a watch over, see the open case back, or you look at the watch and just how things are structured, mostly with the date window where you can see that the movement doesn't really fit within the case. Another thing that you might find is when you open up the case back, you have this plastic movement holder holding the movement into place. This is more of an issue with more attainable watches, but I think from a buyer perspective, it just kind of is not the best look. There are brands out there that have gotten creative with showcasing this. I remember reviewing the Patek 5070 that I reviewed on the channel, what they did to allow that smaller movement to appear larger or not feel out of place, especially on the dial standpoint, because you're talking about chronograph and where those registers are going to be positioned. That's going to be very much dictated by the movement on the flip side. So how they were able to bolster up that bezel and allow it to appear that it's not so small within the case, I think was a pretty interesting way of going about it without making it feel like total lack of thought. So one of the most overblown ideas I think in watchmaking where people are pretty much unreasonable is around water resistance. I think people always think that they need more water resistance than they actually do, but let's be frank. I think if you can get more water resistance without making the watch crazy, just bigger or totally impacting the wearability or the price, I think most people would like to have more water resistance than not. It's always a nice feature to have, just to have that peace of mind. But when brands potentially really overlook this to a point where like it's just so off, I think this is where I make this next point, the whole idea about around water resistance. I think one that comes to mind is with the Due collection from Panerai. Although those watches are positioned more toward non-Panerai buyers, the idea of having a brand like Panerai have watches in like this dive watch format that are only 30 meters of water resistance is kind of silly to me. Another one that I see people bring up all the time, despite the ISO standard for a dive watch being for the 6425 standard being 100 meters, people mention the Oris Diver 65 only having 100 meters of water resistance with the name dive watch in the name or divers in the name. I think this is making it a more easy target. And although I do think this is probably more than enough for pretty much everybody out there on the market, I do get the point. I do see that when you look at the market for dive watches, it seems like the modern standard is 200 meters. So when you see something less than that marketed as a dive watch, I could see why there's going to be some pushback. And just to be real, I think if Oris did have the Diver 65 with 200 meters, I do think it would just kind of be a checkmate to many of the critics that would say, oh, it's not enough. And I bet they would sell more because of it. So just in general, more water resistance is typically better. Doing the extra test, as long as it doesn't add thickness to a crazy degree, I do think most people would prefer more than less. And for our last point here, similar to the idea around water resistance, I think people do overblow this idea around accuracy of a watch. I get really annoyed when people are saying, oh man, my Timex or my Seiko is running plus 25 to 30 seconds a day. Well, look out of the box specifications for those base level movements from those brands, and you'll be like, okay, all right, that makes sense. Like a basic Miyota, the plus or minus range of deviation is pretty wide. So if it is running, say 25 seconds off, I mean, that is within the realm of possibility that they quoted out. But what I really think is the problem here is when brands don't do any regulation and they're maybe even getting close to those outskirts and just don't put much effort in as you start to get higher up. There are brands that do this exceptionally. Like I think of a brand like Zinn with their watches, Mido with their many chronometer watches that they're creating, but also just their regular watches. I think many of the Mido watches I've tested, really solid. Same with Zinn, Longines. They're brands that have developed reputations for having some pretty good regulated watches that are going to run, say, a few seconds off from perfect time of day, even though they don't necessarily need to. They're not COSC certified chronometers, but it's really cool to see that. Where I think this gets a little rough is when you have brands that clearly don't regulate their watches whatsoever. They'll just take in a Bosch movement, case it up, and that's pretty much all it is. This is clearly a cost-cutting measure. It's not necessarily required, but it's always nice to see. And it shows when a brand has closer attention to detail and wanting to go the extra mile for the consumer. Where I think this gets really rough is in the high horology sphere, where the idea of accuracy and the products sometimes don't intersect at all. And you'll get a lot of high horology watches that are sometimes performing in terms of an accuracy standard like a basic off-the-shelf ETA 2824, if not worse. So that's never good, especially when they talk about using these ideas of like hand assembled and adjusted at X positions, and then you get the watch and you're like, oh boy, it's 14 seconds off from perfect time of day and I spent $50,000. I wouldn't probably care at that point because that's not why I'd be buying that watch, but it is kind of silly to me. You go the extra mile to put this perlage finishing on the flip side of the base plate where only the watchmaker will be able to see it. Then the accuracy of the watch is off by 20 seconds. I think that's just kind of a funny, weird world that you live in. But all right, guys, that is my list of things that brands do to cut corners when it comes to developing watches. Not all these are insidious. Some of them are a little bit more just oversights and maybe not going the extra mile, but it's always good as a consumer to know what to look out for when buying your next watch. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. That's a big help. Really would appreciate it as well. Also, definitely check out that article down below looking at some of the best options under $500 for automatics. And then in addition to that, definitely check out TeddyBaldassarre.com. Wide selection of different watches, full authorized dealer of 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.